I think the whole idea is that obviously I want to do more things that I love, but it looks to me like game development is somewhat broken. And I feel like the web has some of the answers, not all of them, definitely. And so the ideal outcome in the end would be to just kind of more democratize like making games and like making it much easier to build games.
Hey folks, before we start, I'd like to remind you that our full episode is only available to our paid subscribers. You can support us by subscribing on Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. In the full version of this episode, we talked to Christoph about some testing techniques he uses for his game, as well as covering this week's tooltips. Thanks for your support.
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey everyone. I'm really excited to have Christoph Nakazawa on as our guest today. Christoph has done a lot of just prolific tool building over his career. So Christoph, you've been involved in what, like MooTools, Yarn, Metro, Bundler, Jest, like the list goes on. Super excited to talk about that and to talk about what you're doing these days. But before we jump into all of that, would you like to take a moment to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, as you introduced me, I literally just did a Git push because I have a big announcement today. I'm starting a company. I'm starting an indie game and open source tech company in Tokyo called Nakazawa Tech. And so this is, you're getting me at a really good time because I just quit my job. My last day was on Friday. And I'm all in on like building video games and doing open source as of like literally right now. So I'm nervous. I'm really nervous about this.
That is so awesome. I'm very excited for you. A friend of mine, Orda Therox, is working in a game. Do you know Orda? You probably have crossed paths before.
Also a friend of mine, yes.
Yeah.
He's a friend of everyone. He's just a really good guy.
Orda is amazing, yeah. So he's doing a similar sort of thing. That's really great.
Yeah.
Cool. So you've worked on a bunch of different OSS tools, like Justin mentioned them: Jest, Metro, Yarn, MooTools. Like that in itself is a crazy list. What drove you to focus on open source tooling so much, and did the Facebook culture at the time help steward your open source efforts?
Oh yeah, that's a really great question. And the blog post that I just published about building a company, I go into detail there because I started coding 22 years ago when I was 12 years old, and I wanted to build video games. So this is, in a way, what I'm doing now is kind of like going back to the roots. And like back then, Microsoft wasn't as celebrated as it is now in the developer community. So pretty early on, I like started using Linux. And then there's this book by like Linus Torvalds. It's called Just for Fun. And like in that one, he describes like the early history of Linux and like how he kind of just, built it and it was so much better than everything else. And he just put it out there for free. And, there's all this controversy about like his like conduct online. And like, I don't want to, none of that is good. And like, I don't like him for all that part, but like the core principles of like how he like started like a large part of the open source movement. Obviously there were others, but like Linux is like one of the most celebrated ones. So that really inspired me from early on when I started coding. And then I pretty early on, I found this library called moo.fx that was like a precursor to MooTools. And then there were a few other moo.something. And I think Valerio Peretti, the creator of MooTools, he just found that funny. Like he was like, oh, cows and moo, and that's funny. But then later on he put together MooTools and he called it My Object Oriented Tools, which is definitely like the name was there before the meaning. And so I got like and I grew up in Austria, so my native language is German. So it actually took me a really long time to learn enough English as a teenager to be able to communicate in an English speaking environment. And I made a lot of mistakes there, but generally the thing was that I really loved the idea of like, hey, I'm building something and that's useful for me and it's probably also useful for you. Like it might be, but I'm just gonna give it to you and I have no expectation that you'll use it, and please don't have any expectation on me to maintain it, right? Like maybe not, and if you like some parts of it but you don't agree with my principles, go and fork it, right? So I was also a really early user of GitHub. I signed up, I looked it up like as part of this announcement that I started. I created my GitHub account in June of 2008, so it's like pretty shortly after it launched, right? So the MooTools crowd like moved onto that really quickly. So the funny thing is, by the time I arrived at Facebook in 2011 as an intern, most people at Facebook, there was no open source program, right? Well, there was one, but it's very small, right? Like it wasn't like a recognized brand as it is now, right? Like it was pre-React. There was no like open source library like by Facebook, or no open source front end library by Facebook. They did a few other small things, I think, in the PHP world. But at the time when I arrived as an intern, very few engineers at Facebook like used GitHub. So I was actually, as an intern, the like most followed like GitHub user. Like I had like so many followers on GitHub. GitHub is also like kind of a social network. So I think early on like I had this, but then so that's like a long answer for like your question about how I got to like Facebook, I guess. But then when I worked at Facebook, I definitely appreciate like everything that Facebook has done and like the support they gave me and like pursuing some of this open source work. That said, it's definitely always been a challenge to like justify why would you go and do this work on like open source, and like a lot of it is just like, okay, we have this thing that library is open source, but we also need it at Facebook. And so if you can align like what you're doing in a way that is like good for Facebook and also good for open source, then you kind of can do both, right? Very easily, right? It's easy to justify. And then you do a little bit on top, maybe outside of work hours to like make the open source project really awesome. So that's kind of like, how I got into open source, and also like how Facebook supported me, or, how I just forced myself to like do open source without anyone really like, asking me or something.
In those early days, was it sort of hard to get people excited inside Facebook about open source?
No, on the engineering level, never. Like engineers, like they all got it. I think a large part of Facebook was just always, from the first day on, was like built on open source. Obviously I cannot speak to that. I wasn't there, but from the outside, at least it looked like that. It was all Apache and like PHP and like whatever like it started with, very very like a basic stack. And most engineers like really got it. And it's the challenge I think that you have in engineering and also in like some levels of leadership is to just make the case of like, hey, we want to open source this, like why does it matter? And I think that has definitely gotten a lot easier, where I haven't been at Facebook Meta for 2 years, but I'm looking at it, they just very liberally open source a lot of stuff like in the AI space, and like that just gets taken and like advanced so much. So I think it's very clear now that like Facebook benefits from it. Back then, when React was released, it was definitely not expected to have this huge impact, and as you probably all saw the React documentary, people were like, oh, this doesn't make any sense. But then once people caught on to how awesome React is, and then a lot of other libraries came out around it, Facebook in the front end space was able to build a brand, right? And then it very easily became this, okay, we're doing open source well, and that is going to help us bring awesome engineers into the company. And also, we're benefiting from the contributions of people that are out there externally. And, it's a bit of, it's interesting because like there's so much hype around AI, and very little talk about like, what the impact of Facebook's front end open source program, which I think has been huge in the front end community.
Yes, say what you want about Facebook. There's opinions you can have for sure, but like their efforts in open source definitely should be applauded. Like literally just today, they released a text-to-speech AI that works with like 4,000 languages. Some languages that only like are spoken by 75 people work with this AI now. So like the quality of work they put out too is just incredible.
Yeah, and my take is that this is my impression, and this is one reason why I liked working at Facebook so much, and also why I'm so appreciative that I got to work on open source at Facebook, is that it very much like aligned with those principles that I had, where it's like, and this also in the community can be frustrating, but like a lot of Facebook open source is like, hey, we find this useful, or this is a research project, and here's the code, do whatever you want. In some cases, the license, and there was also the React and patents. I don't know if you go back a few years, there's like a lot of stuff where nobody had any nefarious thing in mind, but that's kind of just like the way we got to get a lot of code out of the door. But Facebook was a lot like, okay, we think this is useful. We hope this is useful for you. And then, some teams have always been struggling with like getting enough folks to help out with like making open source awesome. Like if you look at, for example, TypeScript that has like 50 to 100 people or something working on it at Microsoft, and they all primarily work on the open source project because everyone else at Microsoft is also a downstream customer of that. That's a very different setup from like a type checker at Facebook, where they only ever had like 5 to 7 people work on it and like very little time to support open source, right? So I think that like quite often it's misunderstood, where the community has expectations on like certain open source projects just because they're backed by a big company. But then in the end, what that team does, a little bit is open source, but like 90% of their time is spent on supporting internal use cases. And the reason why some open source projects are awesome in open source is because some individuals are just so excited about working on them, and there's nothing that can stop them.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to discount that, like, you get really, really smart people who are very, very excited about solving a problem, and they end up producing some really amazing things.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the role that you've played in developing these projects, how have you helped make them successful, or what are the like key aspects that you think were required to make them successful?
That's a great question. And I just when I talk about like what people at Facebook are doing in like what they've done in the past and like what they're doing now, this is all just like my impression, so I cannot speak for them. And I also kind of want to take myself out of that, because I think there's a lot of open source projects that others did that are way more amazing than anything that I ever did. And I feel like my contributions, maybe people appreciate them, but I think there's a lot of ways in which they could have been much better. I think the one thing that I learned that I was really good at is getting people excited about the stuff that I'm working on, or like getting people to understand what the value is of like having a certain system exist in a certain way. And I think Jest is like a really good example where early on, I actually didn't want to work on it. Like the reason why it was open source. So I had always been working on like testing and like, even back in the MooTools days, but also when I was like an intern at Facebook in 2011. But then the reason why Jest was open source is because React was going to be open source. And so all the tests for React were written using Jest internally, right? And so it's like, okay, if we're going to open source React, then if we cannot open source the test framework to run the test, that's like, useless, right? And so, the mission there was, hey, take this thing that we have internally, it kind of works for us, and just put it out there in open source. And the person that did that, Jeff, he was awesome. But then right after that, he was like, okay, I'm going to go work on something else, right? So nobody ever really worked on Jest for like, from 2013 when React was released until like 2015 when I started working on it. And so everybody kind of hated it, right? Like in open source, people were like, what is this? We don't use it. It's or like we started using it, but it sucks. So we stopped using it. And at Facebook, it's like, well, we're stuck with this like thing with like 10,000 test suites and it takes like an hour to run them. And so my manager, Tom Okino at the time, I was like kind of shopping around for like a new thing to work on. And he's like, hey, Christoph, go work on Jest. And I'm like, no way, I'm not going to touch this. It kind of sucks. But then the thing was that, everybody was like, hey, you got to rewrite this. And I kind of tried to take his suggestion seriously, because, he was always coming from a really good place, and like he's always supported and mentored me really well. And I tried to look at it, and I was like, everybody was kind of saying, let's rewrite this thing. Let's, just build a new test runner, not rewrite, like build a new one, don't call it Jest, build it, call it something else. And then I looked into it and I realized actually like the ideas here are really good. It's just that nobody has maintained it. And like there's a lot of assumptions that were made about, the scale of our code base that are no longer true, or that, the code base just grew much faster, right? So what if we take everything about Jest, it doesn't make sense to rename it, or it doesn't make sense to build a new thing, because all the tests at Facebook would have to be rewritten for the new thing, right? And so I just made a plan of like, okay, how do we just make this like 10 to 30 times faster so we can run all the tests in like a few minutes? And that was, a huge amount of tests back then. So like literally 10,000 test suites, that's like 10,000 files testing like millions of lines of code. How can we do that? How can we improve the ergonomics? How can we improve the API? How can we add like new features to it? And so through that, I started finding partners, and like ads was like a very obvious one, where it's like, hey, if we make a mistake here, that's going to cost us money, right? So I was able to build some allies. I was able to find some allies in the ads team. One of the most awesome was this Aaron Abramov, and like he kind of just joined Facebook and then joined the ads team, and then we just worked together full time, even though we were like kind of a virtual team. But like he was so excited to work with me, and so I think overall. Sorry, this is like a long-winded answer of how I got into like working on Jest, but the point is that getting people excited about a mission and like, making that happen, that's really what has helped me work on open source and make awesome open source projects happen. And then outside of Facebook, I went and also built like a core community of contributors for like Jest, for example. So it wasn't just like an internal thing, but I think that's also something, especially if you're not working at a specific company that supports open source, you have to just go out there and like find people that are excited about a project. And that's how I also then ended up moving to engineering management because I found that I'm just so much more excited about having, working with people that work on those projects, and then, them being excited and them having good career outcomes because they're working on these kind of tools. That made me so much happier than like building things myself at the time.
Yeah, community is key, and I think all of your accomplishments, or your team's accomplishments, really show that. So speaking about Jest a little bit more, I think I've seen you talk about this on Twitter a few times, but I've seen the Jest maintainers at large refer to Jest as being a thing that could be more than just a test runner. It could be like your task runner. I saw you had a blog post where you made it into a bundler. So like what hidden potential does Jest have, and maybe we haven't like quite used yet, or may never use?
Yeah, I would say may never use. I think, that was more something that made sense 5 or 6 years ago. It doesn't make as much sense anymore now. So all those things that like we kind of popularized with like Lerna and Yarn was this like whole idea of like mono repos, right? Back then, all the open source repos were like, here's like all the code in one folder, and like you cannot take it apart, right? And so when I was rewriting Jest, like all the internals of Jest, I tried to start splitting it up, and that's kind of how all the projects start nowadays. But back then it was just not obvious, right? And then over time I realized, okay, so there's like 30 packages or so that like compose Jest, and so you can actually take 5 of them to turn it into a bundler. You can take 5 of them to build a package manager if I wanted to, And there was like all of these things where I think if 5 years ago we had built a bundler on top of Jest, it would have been much faster than anything that had existed 5 years ago. That said, now there's a lot of progress on like building these kind of like mono tool chains, right? There's Bun, that just like they have a test framework, they have a bundler. There's Dino, right? Like so all of that kind of moved from, I had like the basics for JavaScript infrastructure all written in JavaScript, and now all of that moved into like Dino and Bun, and then there's like Turbo Pack and Turbo Repo, and like all the stuff that Vercel is doing is kind of like going into this. Here's a mono tool chain kind of. So that was definitely, the potential was there. It was never something that would have made sense at Facebook, I would say, but also the team was just not large enough to, at the time, to like go after that vision. There was like other stuff that we were focusing on. But yeah, the basics all there. And yeah, as you said on my blog, I'm taking the Jest thesis to build a bundler, and you can basically build anything with it. Now I would not suggest anyone to go and do it. Like I think you can build better foundations in 2023 than we had in 2018, and like you would start with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's been very gratifying to watch a lot of the tool chains and the whole ecosystem mature. And one of the things that I've always been, very positive about the front end ecosystem, despite people being, having like, frustrations about how much churn there is and how frequently things change. But it has been really gratifying just to watch the sort of evolution of all of these products and projects like really come together. And it's like the dev experience we have these days is, so much better than it was in, the early 2010s.
Absolutely. Sure. One thing that I want to add there, though, is that I think people often get too attached to their tools. And like I definitely made that as a mistake when I was an engineering manager for the first time. I was managing JavaScript infrastructure, and I was like, hey, we're the team that's building Yarn, Jest, and Metro. But what it should have been is like be much more problem and solution oriented, where it's like, hey, we're solving bundling for Facebook, we're solving testing for front end at Facebook, and we're solving package management. And then, what I learned is when people get too attached to projects, it's very hard to get them out of that. But also they'll, quite often, and including myself, I'm not speaking about others, it's like, if you get attached to something, you're like, okay, how can I make this thing just a little bit better, instead of throwing it away and being like rethinking it. And that's one reason why I'm so excited about vtest is that it's basically a re-implementation or reimagination of Jest, but in 2022 2023, built on Vite, which is definitely, in my opinion, the best bundler, because it's just like so incredibly fast and like still all mostly JavaScript except for the ES build part. So what I care a lot about is like the ideas surviving, and like the ideas actually that are in Jest, like they all still make sense, they're all relevant, because vtest is more or less like copy, I would say. I hope that's okay to say. I don't want to be unfair to the VTest team, because they are doing a lot of stuff from the ground up. They're having a lot of inventions. They're building a lot of stuff into VTest that we never were able to build into Jest. But the core idea of the testing API is basically the same. The way it looks, the way the watch mode works, all of that is very similar and inspired by it. If you look at the code, a lot of it is definitely taken from Jest, which I'm totally a fan of. I'm not saying that as a negative. It's all, the whole idea of open source. We threw some code over the wall. If it's useful for you, take it, fork it, build your own thing, make it better. And so I actually think that's a really good example of how open source can go really well. And my recommendation is just for people to not get too attached to something, because quite often the sentiment is oh, why did you build a new thing? Couldn't you have just built it into that old thing? It's yeah, but that would have made everything slower, larger. It would have moved much slower because you have to argue with a lot of people. So sometimes it's better to just burn it down and build something new.
Yeah, we build lots of assumptions into our code, and those assumptions change over time, and just shedding those is not a trivial thing and can often result in the project looking like it's getting worse rather than better.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a few cool new tools that are out there, but what are your what are the most exciting tools to you that are coming out right now? Because we're kind of in a golden age of JavaScript evolving.
Oh yeah. Yeah, as I said, Vite and VTest, and the entire Vite ecosystem, what the folks there, Evan, Patak, I don't know what his real name is actually, Anthony Fu, what all those folks are doing is really, really impressive work. I think there's this whole split now, right? We're going into this direction of okay, should JavaScript tools be always written in JavaScript? Or should JavaScript tools be written in another language, but they're supporting JavaScript? It's a tough decision, right? Where you go to another language like Rust, which is a lot faster but a lot slower to write, but harder to interface with JavaScript when you're trying to think of a plugin system. And I don't know actually. It seems there's enough room for all of these to exist. But I'm still a fan of the JavaScript-based tools, because when the tools are written in the same language, it's a much easier way. It's much easier for people to contribute to them. And if your entire tool chain is written in another language, then maybe all the code should be written in that language, right? Whereas so I'm not exactly sure where we're gonna go there. But for now, I'll try to always bet on JavaScript. Obviously, there's some things where other languages just make a lot of sense, though.
Yeah, this is something we talked to Charlie Marsh about back on episode 54. So he's writing Python tooling in Rust.
Oh, yeah. Right.
But I mean, we're seeing sort of this hybridization, be it WASM stuff, which we'll have some episodes coming out about soon, or whether it's just this Rust tool chains being embedded either as a full layover, say Rome, where it's just we're rewriting everything in Rust, or just things that leverage stuff like ES build. So it's there's a Go core, and then everything else around it, there's a lot of JavaScript that powers it. I find it really interesting. I feel we've gained a lot, and this is my personal opinion, I feel we've gained a lot by setting aside a little bit of the purism, but to focus on we do want to make these projects approachable, but we also want to have these really nice characteristics, and finding the right trade-offs per tool, per community, per ecosystem for that has been
absolutely. And I think this is one reason why, from having worked on a bundler, why Vite is so exciting to me, because it uses ESBuild or SWC, whichever one you want to hook in. But the act of taking a JavaScript file and compiling that into a different type of JavaScript file that is heavily string based, you have to traverse a bunch of trees, that's much faster in languages that are not JavaScript, right? So Rust or Go or other languages, and it definitely makes sense for that stuff not to be JavaScript. But then Vite is almost everything else. Well, yeah, I think everything else is actually JavaScript, right? The minify is also ES-built, and maybe rollup could be faster if it was written in Rust or in Go, but all the layers around that, starting a dev server, figuring out HMR, dependency tracking, all that there's probably very little point in rewriting that in another language, and like keeping it in JavaScript allows you to move much faster, right? So I think that hybrid approach probably makes a lot of sense. And the problem is then when people are like, hey, let's rewrite all of this in Rust, and then in the end it's like 2 times faster. 2 times is still great, it's not nothing, but it's like, okay, if we want to rewrite this whole thing and like make all these trade-offs of like, around other than performance, there's some negatives as well, then it has to be 10 times or 20 times or maybe even 100 times faster. And like people are so excited, like, oh, we rewrote it in another programming language and it's 2 times faster. And it's like, okay, and you spend like how much time on that, and like how much more maintenance is that? Yeah, I think it has to be balanced.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, writing it in another language seems like a silver bullet, but if you look at Bun, I don't think all of the wins are just because he's writing it in Zig. It's because he is optimizing down to the bit. Like, there's a lot you can do before switching languages to optimize your performance.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you obviously have to talk to Jared about that, but this is like another aspect of open source that I love. That like sometimes you just have specific people that are just so excited about one particular thing, and like Bun and Zig and like Jared being obsessed with performance, that's like one of those things, right? So yeah, power to him. Let's see where it goes. I'm super excited, and yeah, you're right. Maybe he could have chosen another technology, and like it would also be as fast just because it's him who's building it.
Yeah.
This makes me think of the conversation we had with Steve Krause too. So he tried to start a startup that was like, oh, we're just going to do WASM stuff and make your, digital projects really fast by, adding this native element in there. And the finding was like performance on its own is really hard to sell. And B, it's like sometimes it's not actually as fast as you think it is. And it really like performance is more. Well, it's as much of a mindset as it is a particular set of technological decisions. It's like you have to be really focused on it, and you can write performant code in whatever ecosystem you're in. It's just, yeah.
Okay, so one more question, not about Athena Crisis before we move on to Athena Crisis. You have an interesting blog post on your blog about front-end developers. I often joke on this podcast that I'm just a front-end developer, but I really do think that it's a very varied field, and there's lots of depth there that you might not initially see if you're just like, oh, it's a person who knows how to put boxes on screens. So could you explain a little bit the different archetypes that you explain, and then which one you think you are?
Yeah, great question. So I wrote this blog post about front-end engineering archetypes. I actually started a blog post on interviewing for front-end roles from a like company perspective. Like you're like, okay, I need somebody to figure out this front-end. You're like OpenAI that like it's like just cannot get that CSS right for like picking between like the language models, right? And it's like we want to hire a front-end engineer. So I wrote that like a draft of it. And I'm like, wait, no, actually first I have to like go back and explain the archetypes, and then all this stuff with like starting my own company happened. So I didn't get back to the actual thing I wanted to write about, which is so often how it happens. I will get to it eventually, but basically, yeah, I've been basically a front-end engineer for my whole engineering life, right? Like not just career, but also like when I started like coding. The thing that really always defined me is that, obviously I'm excited when like I'm super obsessed with performance and stuff has to be fast. But when it's in service of like printing a few numbers in a terminal, I'm just not that excited about it, right? I'm more like, okay, what do you put on the screen on like a website ideally that you can share with the whole world immediately, right? And like, what does that look like? And that's why when I'm like building front-end stuff, I can never just work with like a mock-up. I'm like, okay, obviously I have to stop at some point, but I'm like, I'm going to try to make this as good as possible and then move on to the next thing. I cannot be like, oh, this is just a placeholder. I always need to just be like, okay, this is what it needs to look like. And so very early on, I knew like I was a front-end engineer because that's just where my passion is. And then from working at Facebook, and so when I was in Menlo Park at first for like 4 years, and then I moved to London, and there I had the opportunity to kind of help with front-end hiring, besides just doing interviews, but more on like a holistic level of like figuring out and like for all of Facebook London, like how many front-end engineers do we need per year? Who is going to be interviewing, how to train the interviewers. I trained a lot of them. How do we stay calibrated across like the front-end interviewing team so that we all conduct interviews in like a similar way? And part of that, like for me, was and that was not like a Facebook concept like the archetypes, but that was more like, here's like what I think are the archetypes for front end, right? And so the 4 ones that I defined are product engineer, UI infra engineer, designer, and tooling infra engineer. And so the product engineer is, I think, the most commonly one that people associate with front end, where it's like, hey, go, here's a mockup, go and like implement that. And the thing is that, that's like a very specific type of front end engineer that loves doing that. And I think even though it's the biggest one, most people would be like, oh, I'd rather work on tooling, or I'd rather work on design systems or something like that, right? So that's, I think, the most common one. But most companies also don't really have the have the size and the scale where it makes sense to like really separate it, right? So most often you'll find a product engineer and it's like, yeah, I figure out how our package manager works, how our bundler works, and like how we ship that to the front end. But ideally, if you can scale up your org, product engineers don't have to think about that. They just go in, write their React components, go make product happen. And then the really excited ones are the exciting ones are the ones that can really communicate with your entire organization, like, with the designer, with the backend engineers, with the PM, with the managers, across the organization to like build great products, and not just build the buttons, but like actually build user experiences, right? Another one was the UI infra engineer. That would be the one that's sitting right below the product engineers, right? And those are the ones that build design systems. Those are the ones that like actually work, like maybe are even embedded with the design team. And they are like, okay, we see each team building their own button. We're going to go build our button. And then they're like, oh shit, we have to figure out typography first. We have to figure out paddings and margins, right? A lot of that stuff is maybe getting a little bit easier with like tools like Tailwind, but I feel like at a sufficiently large size, every company needs to have product folks and then UI infra engineers below it. Then there's one archetype, and that's the one that I love the most working with, actually, is the designer. And maybe I love working with them because that's the one I'm clearly not. I can definitely tell you. I'm not great at design, but those are the ones that are usually like self-taught, or they have like some, I would say, weird like career path. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's more like, oh, I was an English teacher in Cambodia, and then I came back and I did design. And then I went to this school to learn how to do design. And then I was like, oh, actually, I want to implement it. And I learned coding, like kind of like that sort of story. And those are usually like super interesting people that have like they're super creative, have absolutely great ideas. And they can go and like and come up with a design in, whatever design tool they're using, and then also implement it. And then they come in and it's like, okay, and I've just dropped WebGL in it, and now it's like 3D or something like that, right? And you're like, wow. And like those are the ones that like make amazing splash pages, for example. And then the final one is, I guess, the tooling infra engineer, and that's the one that I would identify with the most, given the stuff that I used to work on. Those are the folks that actually go and like figure out all the infrastructure and build it. But now I'm, trying to get back a little bit more into the product engineering side as well. Like I'm, trying to be full stack front end, if that's a word.
Yeah, those archetypes really resonate with me. Like I think I started out as product, but then like slowly crept more and more into infra, to where like at my old job at Intuit, I was design systems and design systems tooling. So squarely in those two brackets. Then I recently left and went to Descript, a startup, and was like full stack product. But then slowly like my expertise came in, and all those responsibilities piled onto me. And like I built our design system and handle lots of our tooling. So yeah, I really think those are good archetypes. And if people are getting into front end, they should like learn about them so they can go deeper on the topics.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to what you said? Because so one reason why I want to write about these things is because I feel like having been an engineering manager for the last 6.5 years or whatever, there's certain things that you learn about these sort of, like positions and like profiles and like people, and like how to make them work together, how to make them happy, like how to, make everyone happy, basically. And so one reason why I actually wrote this is because what I've seen in some engineering orgs where I've been in is that engineers are treated as like this fungible good, where it's like, oh, that's just a resource, right? Like, and okay, this is, I guess, a front-end engineer, so let's go put him on that team and work, like have them work on that thing, and like, and so the problem is it doesn't work like that, right? And you really need to figure out what is somebody's passion, And the best way to start is by them knowing what their passion is, because then you can just ask them, right? Like quite often with like more junior folks, they haven't figured it out yet. They still have something to learn, but more senior folks, they will really know. And then if you come and it's like, hey, actually, I know you like design systems, but now I need to work here, need you to work on a new bundler. And then you go and you're like, okay, sure, I'll do it. And then you're like, I actually really hate this. And then, you won't be good at it. You won't be happy. Nobody will be happy, right? And so knowing what you like doing the most, and like being able to share that with like your manager and the people around you, and like trying to get into a position where you get to do that more of the things that you love. I guess that's also the story of like why I'm starting a company, but in general, like it leads to better outcomes, right? And like makes people more happy. So that's one reason why I'm trying to maintain this blog and like write about these things.
Yeah, I had a manager a while back who I had this kind of continual conversation with. Is like, I'm trying to do this work and it's really hard, but I want to get better at it. And, it's just like I'd kind of sort of continually banging my head against it. And he'd sort of stop me and he's like, but you're really, really great at like this other area of work. You should just focus on this and take what you're already good at and just get so much better at it. And then, it's like that level of contribution is sort of interesting and important to understand. So I do appreciate the archetypes. And another thing that I think is really important is just like having a way to refer to things, having words to describe them is also really important to say, oh, actually, this is what describes me, or this is what describes what I like. So it's cool to see, and definitely if there's anybody who's junior who's listening who are like, well, I thought I really liked front end, but I'm doing this thing and it's really annoying and I'm really having a hard time, it's probably a really great signal that there is something else out there for you that will really, light your fire and get you excited, and you should explore.
Yeah, so I have two daughters now, Mia and Lena. Mia is 5 and Lena is 1, and I think so much about, what do they want to do, and like what should they do, or like how do they learn, right? And so what I read and what makes a lot of sense to me is that there's two things that you need to learn anything. One is that you have to have a passion, you have to be excited about it, and 2 is you have to spend time on it. And when you can align those two things, then usually you'll get good at something and you'll actually learn something. And so, first off, not giving people the time to like learn something, always a bad choice. And also putting people on projects that they don't enjoy, always also a bad choice. Obviously at like smaller companies, you don't have that choice, right? So I'm really talking about like larger organizations where that choice usually exists, where, I've seen a lot of engineers that are like, hey, I'm just not good at this, and it's like, yeah, but we don't have anything else to work on, and that really sucks, right? And so ideally you always find a spot where people can be happy, and then that leads to really great outcomes, and they'll learn something.
So speaking of being happy with what you're working on, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your new game and your new company. So your new game is called Athena Crisis. So what is it exactly, and why did you choose to build it?
Yeah, so it's a 2D turn-based strategy game, and it's kind of inspired by games that existed like 20 years ago. The thinking primarily was that as I said earlier, I started coding to create video games, and I did that as a teenager. So I built like video games and social networks. That was before I knew Facebook existed. And so I spent like 10 years at Facebook. So I feel like the social networking box is kind of ticked. I still love Facebook. I'd be happy to work at Meta anytime, but I kind of did that, right? And so I kind of thought after 2 years at Stripe, like what am I really passionate about? What do I really want to do? And so I kind of thought maybe I want to go back to like building video games. And so I actually built a similar turn-based game in high school. So that was like 17 years ago or something, but it didn't have like animations. It didn't have the right data structures. It didn't have an AI. It didn't have fog of war. Like basically it was really bare bones. I felt like at the time, wow, that was really cool that I was able to build that, but it just had so much missing stuff. And there was no way I could have ever built that back then with the knowledge that I had, without rewriting the whole thing, right? And so about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I just got that old game to run again in a Docker container. It was all written in PHP 5, and I got like a Docker container running with that code. Trying to run a 3-year-old JavaScript project, do an npm install, it's impossible to get that to run, right? Yeah. But I was able to run like a 17-year-old code base on a Docker container. It was amazing.
That's wild.
And so I just thought, man, wouldn't it be cool to like actually build an AI, because I have absolutely no idea how to do that. And for me, when I read online like, hey, how do you build an AI for a video game, and it's like, here are all the steps, and I'm like, I don't get it. I actually have to go and do it, right? And so also our second daughter was born, and it's just amazing to have two children, but it's also really exhausting. So I needed something to balance that, and so I started as a meditation project, kind of like just from scratch. How do I build this? And I put one really weird constraint on myself, that was I'm only allowed to use tools that I fully understand. Obviously, we mentioned Orta already, right? And like he had this talk back when he was an artsy, that they want to only use open source that they also could maintain if the maintainers drop out, right? And there's like kind of this idea of like you control your entire stack. And so for me, it was like, I don't really know game engines. I don't understand them. So the only way I can use it is if I build it from scratch. But I know React, I know Relay, I know like all these front-end tools that I either was on the team of or like very close for like a really long time. So that was my constraint, right? And it's like, how far can I get with that? And over time, this hobby kind of turned into something real. And so the other thought is just that building a 3D game is just incredibly hard. Like either it's really expensive in terms of like assets, or it's really expensive in terms of like making it. So I thought I'll start out building something 2D, something retro, just to see if I can do it and how far I'll get with JavaScript, CSS, and React.
That's awesome. So you've got a whole custom game engine that's just like, is it mostly just CSS. React on the front end? What does your stack look like?
Well, it's all CSS. so it's obviously images and CSS and React.
That's awesome.
Basically it, yeah. I have run into... So this is another thing, but from having worked in tooling for so long and having worked in as an engineering manager for so long, I haven't done as much CSS. I kept up to date. I know the basics. I kind of grew up with CSS existing, or like evolving, but I never used like all these advanced features. So that was another goal next to like building an AI, is like, become really good at 2023s or 2022s at the time CSS. And I ran into so many issues with browsers. So this is why I put together a talk about how not to build a video game. And I'm going to Amsterdam in a week to speak about that. And I also did a similar talk at Reactathon. There's a bunch of really wild CSS stuff that exists now in browsers, but there's also a bunch of wild ways that you can use it. And so that's the premise of my talk.
Yeah, you use it in a few pretty interesting ways. Like the sprites look like they were really easy using your CSS variables. You have like a global like index that you use to like animate all the sprites, right?
Yeah, I'm really embarrassed about that, because there's a much better way that I reverted back to. So I feel like I did all my research and I looked at everything about the Web Animations API, and I basically want to run as little JavaScript as possible for like just the idle animations. So just for context for those who are listening, there are like units, like an infantry unit or something, or tank on the map, and then they move up and down like they're breathing or like alive, and that's all animated using CSS. And I don't want to run much JavaScript to like get that animation going. And my problem was that with CSS animations, I couldn't align them because they start when an element gets inserted into the DOM. But now finally, even though I thought I had done that research, now finally I learned through doing this talk at Reactathon that there's a thing called document.timeline. And that actually gives you the like current state of like, like a time that starts when you open the page. And that way you can set the current time of an animation to that time, and then all the animations will be in sync. So obviously I'm going to change my approach to that because it's much less clowny than what I have. But this is another way in which it's actually good to go out there and speak about it, because one, I can find bugs in browsers. I can find things that browsers want to remove but shouldn't, because actually it's a really valuable feature and it's needed. And I can also learn about how to actually do things much better than what I came up with.
It's scary how much of the web is built upon those browser features that can't possibly be removed.
Absolutely. Yeah. So actually, I think that warrants maybe like saying, why does any of this make sense, right? Like, maybe there's a way that you could say, no, it actually really doesn't, just go and build it using Unity and like Unreal. But the thing is that, web technologies in some ways, they're like light years behind, but in some ways they're like light years ahead of anything else, right? And so the thing that I can do with my setup is that I can just type and I save in VS Code as I'm typing, and like the code just updates in real time, basically. There's like no compile time. The time it takes me to compile the game and ship it to production is probably less than it takes any other game engine to just go build the game in development to try it, you know? And so those are the sort of things where you get so much value out of that. And so this was also another consideration. It's like, okay, I'm building this game. I love open source. When I'm building a company, I want to build it in the open. You know, obviously I'm not going to open source like the core of the game at this point, but I want to open source as much technology as I can. But even if it's not the technology, because I don't think the game engine I'm building is like one that would actually support like, you know, 3D games. I think there's, you know, WebGL, WebGPU, like all those things make a lot more sense. But there are probably a bunch of ideas that I'm coming up with, or that I already had, that make a lot of sense to popularize in terms of like, here's how. Just backing up, I think the whole idea is that obviously I want to do more things that I love, but it looks to me like game development is somewhat broken, and I feel like the web has some of the answers, not all of them, definitely. And so the ideal outcome in the end would be to just kind of more democratize like making games and like making it much easier to build games, right? And so I don't know exactly what role I can play in that yet, but you know, I'm pretty sure open source will play a huge role, and I want to be a part of like helping in that space.
There's a lot of interesting aspects to your story. So you know, you talked about starting this journey after having kids and sort of needing this meditative exercise and picking things that you knew. Something that is a sort of a common problem that I have with projects, and I know a lot of other people probably stumble across the same thing, is, you know, anything you build takes energy. There is a conversion of like mental energy to some output, and you have to pay especially as you get older and you have less time, you have to be very strategic about how you pay that cost. And I appreciate your strategy here. You're like, you're basically optimizing to pay the cost on, you know, really the nuts and bolts of the game, of, you know, how the technologies that you know fit together to like bring this thing to life. Whereas oftentimes it's so easy to get like really fascinated by like a shiny new game engine, for example, and then you go spend all this energy on the shiny new game engine, and then when it comes to like the core of just like building this thing that you want to share with the world, you just don't have it in you to like sort of finish it out. And that's a really common story. So I just want to give some appreciation for that approach.
You said something absolutely great, and this whole thing of like using things that I know, and like if you jump on something shiny, then everything is new, and you have to like start from scratch, and you don't know what to hold on to, and then the journey is just really like slow, right? Not saying that you shouldn't learn new things. I'm all for that, but you know, time box it, right? Like spend a weekend with a new thing, and then figure out if you want to build on that. But the thing is, you know, yes, the base layer of what I started with, like that's all the tools that I knew. But there's so much that I don't know that I was able to learn through that. Right? You know, one thing where like the whole game is built using immutable data structures, because it's basically, you know, you have a turn-based game, and anytime you make a change, you execute an action, and then you get a new game state back. And like I thought the smartest way to do that is using immutable data structures, because with like especially immutable JS, which I think now is kind of considered as a legacy thing, but the idea is that you know, anytime you change something, you get a new copy back, but then the backing data store is like the same except for that one minor change, right? So that's called persistent data structures. And so you can actually have like, you know, 100,000 game states, you know, in memory, and it will not take up that much space, right? And also it's really fast to add or remove or change something, because you're not recreating that entire thing in memory. You're just making a small change, and then the external representation is like, okay, this thing has changed. And so I was able to get super nerdy on like, okay, immutable. Everybody says immutable JS sucks, and it's slow. And yeah, some parts are slow. Okay, can I make a faster implementation of immutable map? And you know, with the constraints where I'm like, okay, I make one change all the time, and I want the change to be fast when I'm creating a completely new thing of that. And there's just nothing that I could build that was even remotely as fast, right? And so I just forked immutable JS, and I got rid of everything else but immutable map, and then I published that as a separate library, because I don't think there's any better immutable map implementation out there. And even if you're using mutable maps, it's probably faster to copy. Well, if you ever have to copy a large map, it's probably faster to use an immutable one, right? And so I think there's also this whole thing of like people are just going with like all these new technologies without really like evaluating some of them. And maybe sometimes it makes sense to go back and be like, hey, actually this thing from like 5-6 years ago is actually still the best at that. So what I'm saying is you can learn a lot of things by using the things that because you get to focus on like learning things that you didn't get to invest in earlier while still holding on to that base layer of knowledge that you have accumulated.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree with that. It's an extension of learn by doing, but with things you know, so you can learn more. So we've talked a little bit about what web made easier for building this game. Like styling was easier for you, layout was easier, the feedback loop was easier. But what were some things that were hard because you chose the web platform?
Yeah, performance. I think that's like something I still struggle with, where even though I'm not doing that much in terms of like graphical intensity, it's sometimes really hard where, some CSS properties, they're GPU accelerated, but then they're not. And then some other things were like with background images, for example, when you change a position of a background image in like a sprite, it actually bounces back between CPU and GPU all the time. So you spend a lot of time compositing. So there's a lot of stuff that I learned about like how browsers really work, where it's like, this is, you read like how this thing is supposed to work. And then you're like, okay, actually, if you really do this to the max, it's not meant to be used for that, right? So there's definitely an element of, I'm trying to do this with an engine. You could call browsers a game engine in a way if you really wanted to. If you're trying to do that, it's maybe not the ideal setup. But then, there is WebGPU, there's WebGL, so you can always fall back to those kind of modern technologies. I'm still trying to sit in the space of like, how far can I push all the browsers? And like, are these things that browsers are supposed to be able to do or not? And then from another perspective, I think building the AI was not hard, but making a smart AI for a turn-based game is actually incredibly hard, because that's something I still haven't unlocked. Right now the AI that I've landed in is that I've built it to play in a similar way that I would play the game, and it's better than any beginner. So beginners will always lose, but it's worse than any of the experts, people that have played similar games before. So they'll always win. And so that's like this struggle where it's like, okay, I built this intermediate AI bot, but I need to make it like dumber, but also smarter. And like, I don't know exactly how to make it that smart yet. So that's something where it's just really exciting to like figure out how to do that. And the crazy thing is like when you have so many variables that go into the decision-making process for an AI, then you only make a small change. Like you change the weight on like how important something is to the AI from like 0.2 to 0.1, and then it plays completely differently. And so it's super fun and interesting, but also super hard to get that dialed in where it's balanced well, so that it's, all of this is in service of making something that is fun to play. And if the AI comes in and crushes you every time, or if the AI comes in and loses every time, maybe not ideal, right? So that's hard and really fun.
What are some of the parts of the game so far that you've had the most fun building?
I think anytime I figure out something with CSS that nobody ever has thought about, I don't think I'm that smart, but like every once in a while I'm like, damn, this is like so fun. So there's like this whole thing where whenever you select a unit, it shows you the movement radius. And that's like, it's like blue rectangles. So each field gets like a blue rectangle, but then it actually like has this striped pattern. And that is actually like a mask image with a linear gradient. So all of that thing is like all of that stuff is just rendered in CSS. So it's like super dynamic. There's no images involved. Or the movement arrows. So when you like highlight like a specific spot of like where you want to move to, then you get like an SVG generated arrow that like looks pretty nice. And then also it's like animated using CSS animation. So again, there's like no images involved. I think maybe that makes me the most happy is when I get to do something with CSS that previously you could only do with like pre-rendered images or something. And in a way, like CSS feels like a very basic and somewhat slow shader language, right? And I don't really get shader languages. Like I read the tutorials and it's like, this whole thing of like how to draw an owl, right? Like you read a tutorial about shaders and it's like, oh yeah, I know how to make this rectangle blue or something. And then it's like, I have no idea how to like do anything smart with them, right? So I wish CSS was way more expressive and like could kind of be like a simple shader language for the web. I think I don't know if that's the goal for the people working on CSS, but I think that would be a pretty cool thing to go towards.
CSS Houdini kind of fits that, right? Like you
Yeah.
can kind of extend CSS to do whatever you want and do all the hard stuff somewhere on the GPU.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we talked so much about open source, right? And so one thing that I've always been so excited about, and that's something that I learned on early on MooTools. Like MooTools was supposed to be this is for the advanced or intermediate or advanced like JavaScript developer, which didn't exist. Even we weren't in like advanced JavaScript users in 2007 or 8, right? It was like still so early. And so I think we kind of ran that community wrong, and I think it would have been 100 times more successful project if we had said, no, this is a beginner friendly project, here are the docs and like, here's how you figure out how to use it. And so everything about open source that I care about nowadays is like, make it as easy to use for anyone as possible, because you want to bring everyone along, right? And so this is why I'm like, okay, what if CSS could be an easier or simpler shader language, and like, there's too many tools out there that are hard to use or not fun and like, not for beginners, right? And so I'm just excited to make something that has a great user experience and great developer experience. And so, yeah, that's maybe why I'm never happy, right? Because I always get angry when things are not there yet. And, like sometimes I fail at myself, right? Like it's not everything I say, it's not like, oh, I'm so good at this. It's more like, this is what I aspire to make, right? And so I'm hoping to play a part in like making things easier to use as well.
Hey,
Yeah,
friends, before we
absolutely.
start,
Yeah. So we've alluded to it a little bit, but you're starting a new company, Athena Crisis being the first product. So congrats on the announcement that just went out today. What are your goals with the company? Like, what do you want to do next, other than you're starting with open source, but what after that?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I didn't know I was going to build a company a few months ago. So this kind of just happened. I knew I was going to ship the game, and I it just was clear to me after a certain point that like building my own company is the only way to just do that. So it's not that, oh, I really want to build a company. It just seems like the thing you have to do to go and like build the things and do the things that I want to do. And so, yeah, Athena Crisis is the thing that I'm going to spend most of my time on. I'm the only engineer. There's 6 people working on it in total right now. There will be more soon, but they are working on the art and the music, and administrative stuff, translations, all that sort of stuff. I'm currently looking for a narrative designer, also maybe a community manager. Like one of the things we didn't talk about is that Athena Crisis is supposed to be more of like a hybrid online offline experience. So it, you'll it's not just for you to play on your own. It's if you want that it will be supported, and that's totally fine. But the idea is that you actually go and you play with friends as well, or with random people on the internet, and however that will go. So I am hiring people all around the world to like help me in like putting this game together. My engineering time will be mostly focused on open source or the video game. And then after that, I'm hoping that I'll be able to make more games, and it, kind of depends on how this one goes. And it's something that I want to exist, and there's a bunch of other things that I want to build that I want to exist as well. Gaming is one thing. There's other things that I'm excited about, but I'm not yet able to share it. You'll have to wait and see.
we typically ask a forward-facing question, but you sort of preface there that you've got stuff that you want to keep in your bag. So I actually want to ask a little bit of a different question. So you've made this choice. Anytime someone decides to make a company, it's a fairly big choice, and especially you have kids. What I really wonder, what was the impetus? What was the thing that just made you say, all right, you know what, this is time, this is what I need to do, and sort of like how did that unfold for you?
Yeah, great. Just before I answer that, there's like a little add-on to the previous one about like what my goals are, because you were talking about forward-looking stuff. I want to just work on this game. I want to build it. I want it to exist. I'm glad other people want it to exist as well. And I want to do open source. And, there is a really high chance that maybe that doesn't work out. But I also feel like I can go back and do something else later. As I said earlier, I'd be happy to go back to Meta. There's other amazing companies out there. But this just seems like something that I need to do right now. And as part of the process here is that, having 2 children and a family is like a huge part in like making that decision. When you're an engineering manager or like in a leadership position in like a company that is not yours, right? Then you give everyone else the ability to monopolize your time, right? Like your calendar internally is like open and people will just go and be like, oh, there's another spot for 60-minute conversation, right? And then it's like, and then as you just sit there and you like open your laptop, especially if people working remotely and you work from home a lot, you open your laptop and you're just in video calls like from 9 to 6 basically, right? And then it's like, what does this add up to? And it's so hard for me to be like, tell my daughter, so like, hey, I didn't spend time with you because I was in this meeting that I just really don't care about and that doesn't matter to my life or your life or anyone's life really, right? Where it's like we're just like in a very slow organization where nothing is moving. Not saying that my just current previous experience was like that, but I think people who have been in meetings like that will emphasize. And so one part of starting a company is just that it gives me much more control over my own time. I don't mind working at nights and the weekends. I care about working a certain amount of time. And when I feel like it's enough, then it's enough. But I don't care about being there from 9 to 5, being stuck in meetings all the time. So I just want to have more control. And, that's also, easily said. But then if you're starting a business in Japan, there's insane amounts of paperwork involved. So, it's not like all of that is just like fun, but it feels different because it's something that I care about, that like matters to me, and that, I'm hopeful that that will also matter to my family. And it's just a completely different feeling to do boring paperwork or working on spreadsheets when it's your thing compared to when it's somebody else's dream that you're just part of.
Yeah. It's cool. I'm so glad that you're doing it. I think this is something that everybody at one point in their life, if they have the privilege to be able to support themselves and do it, that you should take a moment to live for yourself, before retirement, if possible.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah,
That this is
please.
like, because it's so interesting, like if you have the opportunity, right? And this is definitely, I grew up in a blue collar family in like the countryside in Austria, right? And so doing this sort of stuff is something that I never imagined I would be able to do. And I just thought, and like, you've mentioned family for a few times, and it definitely seems like a really crazy time to do that when my children are so young. And so, the only option is to do it later or now, right? So, and like, I think I would regret if I never do it. And I was really fortunate to, we talked about some of the stuff that I did. I was really fortunate to be part of those things and also having that luxury, I would say, to try this and see if it works or doesn't, right? And I recognize like most people don't. And to me, I'm usually pretty risk averse. So taking a risk of starting a company, I'm nervous. I'm really nervous about it, but I also feel really grateful that I'm able to just go and try this for a little while and see how it goes. Yeah, just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and I think it would be great. And the thing that you said earlier, it's like, if it doesn't work out, I can always just get another job. It's something that I try to remind people. It's like, especially if you're good and you've been doing this for a long time and you're like thinking about, oh, should I do something for myself now? It's like, you can get another job, just try it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you see my CSS.
If you never open source the game, they never have to see it.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Thanks for coming on, Christoph. It was a lot of fun talking to you. You have like a wealth of information and history in the DevTools space, and I'm excited to see where your games company goes.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Christoph, it was a pleasure. And I'm really excited for you. I'm excited for this direction, this new chapter in life. I really honestly just want to see more people exploring their passion and finding some joy in the world. So, yeah, we wish you the best.
Thank you.